The dangers of wisdom. When we see the importance which appearances assume in the normal consciousness, we cannot subscribe to the Vedantic thesis according to which non-distinction is the soul's natural state. What is meant here by natural state is the waking state, precisely the one which is in no way natural. The living man perceives existence everywhere. Once awakened, once he is no longer nature, he begins to discern the false in the apparent in the real, and ends by suspecting the very idea of reality. No distinctions, which means no tension and no drama. Contemplated from too great a height, the realm of diversity and multiplicity vanishes. At a certain level of knowledge, non-being alone survives. We live only by lack of knowledge. Once we know, we are at odds with everything. As long as we are in ignorance, appearances prosper and preserve a flavor of inviolability which permits us to love and to hate them, to come to grips with them. How match ourselves against ghosts? That is what appearances become when, disabused, we can no longer promote them to the rank of essences. Knowledge, or rather the waking state, produces between them and ourselves a hiatus which is not, unfortunately, a conflict. If it were, all would be well. No, this hiatus is the suppression of all conflicts. It is the deadly abolition of the tragic. Contrary to the Vedantic assertion, the soul is naturally inclined to multiplicity and to differentiation. It flourishes only among semblances and wastes away once it unmasks them and turns away from them. Awakened, it forfeits its powers and can neither generate nor sustain any creative process whatever, deliverance being the converse of inspiration. For a writer to dedicate himself to deliverance is tantamount to secession, even to suicide. If he wants to produce, he must follow his inclinations, good and bad alike. If he liberates himself from them, he departs from himself. His misfortunes are his opportunities. His surest means of spoiling his gifts is to set himself above success and failure, pleasure and pain, life and death. Seeking emancipation from them, he will one day find himself external to the world and to himself. Still capable, perhaps, of conceiving some project or other, but panic-stricken at the idea of executing it. Beyond the writer, the phenomenon has a general significance. Anyone aspiring to effectiveness must make a total disjunction between living and dying, must aggravate the pairs of contraries, improperly multiply irreducibles, wallow in antinomies, remain, in other words, on the surface of things. To produce, to create, is to deny oneself lucidity. It is to have the courage or the luck not to perceive the lie of diversity, the deceptive character of the multiple. A work is possible only if we blind ourselves with regard to appearances. Once we cease to attribute a metaphysical dimension to them, we lose all our resources. Nothing stimulates so much as enlarging trifles, maintaining false antitheses, picking fights where none are to be had. If we refuse to do this, a universal sterility would ensue. Illusion alone is fertile. Illusion alone originates. It is by means of illusion that we give birth, that we engender, in both senses of the word, that we participate in the dream of diversity. Unreal though the interval separating us from the absolute may be, yet our existence is that unreality itself, and the interval in question never appears illusory to fanatics of action. The deeper we take root in appearances, the more productive we are. To produce a work is to espouse all those incompatibilities, all those fictive oppositions so dear to restless minds. More than anyone, the writer should know what he owes to these semblances, these deceptions, and should beware of becoming indifferent to them. If he neglects or denounces them, he cuts the ground from under his own feet. He suppresses his materials. He has nothing left on which to work. And if he then turns to the absolute, what he finds there will be, at best, a delectation in stupor. Only a God greedy for imperfection in and outside himself, only a ravaged God could imagine and achieve the creation. Only a being similarly unappeased can lay claim to an undertaking of the same kind. If, among the factors of sterility, wisdom heads the list, that is because wisdom is concerned to reconcile us with the world and with ourselves. It is the greatest disaster which can befall our ambitions and our talents. It settles them. In other words, it slaughters them. It aims a blow at our depths, at our secrets, persecuting those of our qualities which are fortunately sinister. Wisdom saps us. It submerges us. It compromises all our defects. If we have laid violent hands on our desires, persecuted and smothered our attachments and our passions, we shall curse those who have encouraged us to do so. First of all, the sage within ourselves, our most redoubtable enemy, guilty of having cured us of everything without having rid us of the regret for anything. Limitless is the confusion of the man who longs for his old enthusiasms and who, uncomforted for having triumphed over them, sees himself succumb to the venom of quietude. Once we have perceived the nullity of all desires, it requires an effort of superhuman obnubilation. It requires sanctity, in order to be able to experience them again and to give ourselves up to them without reservation. The detractor of wisdom, if he were a believer as well, would never stop repeating, "Lord, help me to fall, to wallow in every error and every crime. Inspire me with words that scorch you and devour me, which reduce us both to ashes." We cannot know what the nostalgia for failure is if we have not experienced that of purity to the point of disgust. When we have dreamed too much of paradise and been a familiar of the beyond, we reach the point of irritation and lassitude. The disgust for the other world leads to the amorous obsession with hell. Without this obsession, religions, in what is truly subterranean about them, would be incomprehensible. Aversion to the elect, attraction to the damned, a double movement of all those who dream of their former follies and who would commit any sin if they no longer had to mount the path of perfection. Their despair is to acknowledge the progress they have made in detachment, whereas their inclinations did not destine them to excel in it. In the Questions of Milinda, King Menander asks the ascetic Nagasena what distinguishes the man without passion from the passionate man. "The passionate man, O king, when he eats, enjoys the flavor and the passion of flavor. The man without passion enjoys the flavor, but not the passion of the flavor." The entire secret of life and of art, the whole of here on earth, abides in that passion of the flavor. When we no longer experience it, there remains for us in our destitution only the resource of an exterminating smile. To advance into detachment is to strip ourselves of all our reasons for action, and by losing the benefit of our defects and our vices, to founder in that depression which is the absence following upon the disappearance of our appetites, an anxiety which has degenerated into indifference, submersion in neutrality. If, in wisdom, we set ourselves above life and death, in depression, as the failure of wisdom, we fall below them. It is there that appearances are leveled, that diversity is invalidated. The consequences are dreadful for the writer especially, for if all the aspects of the world are worth the same thing, he cannot incline toward one rather than another. Whence his impossibility of choosing a subject, which to prefer, if the objects themselves are interchangeable and indistinct. Being itself is banished from this perfect desert as too picturesque. We are at the heart of the undifferentiated, of the dim and seamless one, where, in place of illusion, spreads a prostrate illumination, in which all is revealed to us. Yet this revelation is so contrary to our nature that we long only to forget it. On the basis of what he knows about, no one can move forward, the man of depression less than any other. He lives in the center of a heavy unreality. The non-existence of things weighs upon him. To fulfill himself, merely to breathe, he must emancipate himself from his knowledge, and thus he conceives of salvation by non-knowledge. He will accede to it only by striving against the spirit of disinterestedness and objectivity. An ill-founded, partial, subjective judgment constitutes a source of dynamism. On the level of action, only the false is charged with reality. But when we are doomed to an exact view of ourselves and the world, what can we adhere to? What can we still speak of? There was once a madman in us. The sage has driven him out. With him has gone our most precious possession, which made us accept appearances without having to practice at every turn that discrimination between the real and the illusory which is so detrimental to them. So long as our madman was there, we had nothing to fear, nor did appearances, which, an interrupted miracle, were transformed into things before our eyes. Once the madman was gone, appearances came down in the world, relapsed into their first indigence. He had given a flavor to existence. He was existence. Now, no interest, no vantage point. The real vertigo is the absence of madness. To realize oneself is to dedicate oneself to the intoxication of multiplicity. In the one, nothing counts but the one itself. Let us fracture it then, if we seek to escape the sorcery of indifference, if we want the monotony within and around us to come to an end. All that shimmers on the surface of the world, all that we call interesting, is the fruit of inebriation and ignorance. No sooner have we sobered up than we distinguish everywhere merely repetition and desolation. The consequence of blindness, diversity collapses upon contact with depression, which is a knowledge blasted, a perverse taste for identity, and a dread of the new. When this dread grips us, when there is no event which fails to seem to us both impenetrable and ridiculous, when there is no change of any order which does not proceed from mystery and farce, it is not of God that we dream, it is of the deity, of the immutable essence which does not deign to create or even to exist, and which, by its absence of determinations, prefigures that indefinite and insubstantial moment, symbol of our inconclusiveness. If, from the evidence of antiquity, destiny chooses to pull down all that is raised up, depression will be the price man must pay for his elevation. But depression, beyond man, doubtless affects, to a lesser degree, every living being which, in one way or another, diverges from its origins. Life itself is exposed to depression once it slows down its course and calms the frenzy which sustains and animates it. For what is life, in the last resort, but a phenomenon of fury? A blessed fury, to which it behoves us to submit. Once it seizes us, our unsatisfied impulses awaken. The more repressed they were, the more violently they break loose. Despite its painful aspects, the spectacle we then afford proves that we are reinstating our true condition, our nature, however contemptible and even odious it may be. Better to be effortlessly abject than noble by imitation or persuasion, an innate vice being preferable to an acquired virtue, we necessarily feel awkward in the presence of those who do not accept themselves. The monk, the prophet, the philanthropist, the miser who drives himself to expenditure, the ambitious man who forces himself into resignation, the arrogant man who affects consideration for others, in the presence of all who keep watch upon themselves, not excepting the wise man, the sage, the man who controls and constrains himself, who is never himself. A quiet virtue forms a foreign body. We like it neither in others nor in ourselves. It is a victory over the self which pursues us, a success that overwhelms us and makes us suffer even when we pride ourselves upon it. Let each man be satisfied with what he is. Is not the desire to improve oneself the same as a taste for torture and misfortune? There is no edifying nor even cynical book which fails to insist on the misdeeds of wrath, that performance, that bravado of rage. When blood rushes to the brain and we begin to tremble, in 1 second the effect of days and days of meditation is wiped out. Nothing more absurd and more degrading than such an outburst, inevitably disproportionate to the cause which has produced it. Yet once the outburst is past, we forget its pretext, whereas repressed fury works within us till our dying breath. The same is true of the humiliations which have been inflicted upon us and which we have endured nobly. If, once we have been affronted, we ponder our reprisal, wavering between a slap and the coup de grace, this oscillation, by making us waste precious time, will have thereby consecrated our cowardice. It is an indecision with grave consequences, a fault which oppresses us, whereas an explosion, however grotesque its conclusion, would have relieved us. As painful as it is necessary, anger keeps us from falling victim to obsessions and spares us the risk of serious complications. It is a fit of madness which saves us from madness. As long as we can count on it, on its regular appearance, our equilibrium remains assured, as does our shame. It is easy enough to grant that it is an obstacle to spiritual advancement, but for the writer, since it is his case as well that we are considering here, it is not good. It is even dangerous to control his outbursts of temper. Let him encourage them as much as he can, or risk literary death. In anger, we feel we are alive. Since, unfortunately, it does not last long, we must resign ourselves to its byproducts, which range from slander to calumny, and which, in any case, offer more resources than scorn, too weak, too abstract, lacking heat and energy, and unlikely to afford any sense of well-being whatsoever. Once we leave it behind, we discover with amazement the pleasures of vilifying others. At last we are on an equal footing with them, at grips. We are no longer alone. Before, we examined them for the theoretical pleasure of finding their weak point. Now it is to strike them. Perhaps we should be concerned only with ourselves. It is shameful, ignoble, to judge others, yet that is what everyone does. To abstain would come down to exiling ourselves from humanity. Man, being a rancorous animal, every opinion he utters on his kind participates in denigration. Not that he cannot speak well of them, but in doing so he experiences a sensation of pleasure and power noticeably less than when he speaks badly. If he deprecates and chides them, it is not so much to harm them as to safeguard his own vestiges of wrath, his vestiges of vitality, to escape the debilitating effects of a long practice of scorn. The calumniator is not the only one to gain by calumny. It serves his victim as much, if not more, provided he suffers from it intensely. It then gives him an unsuspected vigor, as profitable to his ideas as to his muscles. It incites him to hate. Now hatred is not a sentiment, but a power, a factor of diversity, which makes beings flourish at the expense of being. Anyone who cherishes his status as an individual should seek out all the occasions when he is obliged to hate, calumny being the best. To regard oneself as its victim is to use an improper expression and to misjudge the advantages which can be derived from it. The evil that is said of us, like the evil that is done to us, has value only if it wounds us, if it lashes us on and wakes us up. Are we so unlucky as to be insensitive to it? Then we fall into a state of disastrous invulnerability. We lose the privileges inherent in the blows of man and even in those of fate. He who rises above calumny will rise without difficulty above death. If what is said about us in no way touches us, why exhaust ourselves in a task inseparable from external approbation? Can we conceive of a work which might be the product of an absolute autonomy? To make ourselves invulnerable is to close ourselves to almost every sensation we feel in the common life. The more we initiate ourselves into solitude, the more we long to lay down our pen. What and whom are we to talk about if others no longer count, if no one deserves the dignity of enmity? No longer to react to public opinion is an alarming symptom of fatal superiority, acquired to the detriment of our reflexes, and one which puts us in the attitude of an atrophied divinity, enchanted to move no longer because it finds nothing which deserves a gesture. Quite the contrary. To feel we exist is to be infatuated with what is manifestly mortal, to worship insignificance, to be perpetually irritated at the heart of inanity, to fly into tantrums in the void. Those who yield to their emotions or to their whims, those who get carried away at any hour of the day or night, are immune from serious difficulties. Psychoanalysis counts only among certain peoples of the North, who have the misfortune to believe in tenue, and is of no interest to the Latin peoples. To be normal, to keep ourselves in good health, we should model ourselves not on the sage, but on the child. We should throw ourselves on the ground and cry every time we feel like it. What is more lamentable than to feel like crying and not to dare? Having unlearned tears, we are without resource, uselessly welded to our eyes. In antiquity, men wept, and in the Middle Ages, or during the Grand Siècle, the Sun King was easily moved to tears, according to Saint-Simon. Since then, aside from the romantic interlude, discredit has been cast upon one of the most effective remedies man has ever possessed. Is this a passing disfavor or a new conception of honor? What seems certain is that a whole realm of the infirmities which torment us, all those diffuse, insidious, unlocalizable ills, come from our obligation not to externalize our furies or our afflictions, and not to indulge our oldest instincts. We should have the faculty of screaming at least a quarter of an hour every day. Screaming rooms should even be created for this purpose. Speech, it will be objected, ought to suffice. Why return to such old-fashioned methods? Conventional by definition, alien to our imperious needs, speech is empty, extenuated, devoid of contact with our depths. Not one word emanates from or ventures into them. If, at the beginning, at the moment when speech first appeared, it could serve, things are different now. Not one word, not even those which were transfigured into swear words, contain the slightest tonic virtue. Language outlives itself, a long and pitiable desuetude. The principle of anemia it conceals is one whose baleful influence we nonetheless still suffer from today. The blood's mode of expression, screaming, on the other hand, arouses us, fortifies us, and sometimes cures us. When we are lucky enough to give ourselves up to it, we immediately feel close to our distant ancestors, who must have howled incessantly in their caves, including those who daubed the walls. At the antipodes of those happy days, we are reduced to living in a society so badly organized that the only place where we can scream with impunity is the lunatic asylum. Thus is forbidden to us the sole method we have of ridding ourselves of the horror of others and of the horror of ourselves. If there were at least books of consolation. Very few exist, for the good reason that there is no consolation and can be none, so long as we do not shake off the chains of lucidity and decorum. The man who contains himself, who masters himself on every occasion, the distinguished man, as we call him, is virtually a nervous wreck. The same is true of anyone who suffers in silence. If we seek a minimum of equilibrium, let us return to the scream. Let us lose no opportunity to throw ourselves upon it or into it, and to proclaim its urgency. Rage will help us. Moreover, rage which proceeds from the very core of life. Hence, we shall not be surprised to find it particularly active in periods when health is identified with convulsion and chaos, in periods of religious innovation. No compatibility between religion and wisdom. Religion is swaggering, aggressive, unscrupulous. It advances and is embarrassed by nothing. The admirable thing about it is that it condescends to favor our lowest sentiments. Otherwise, it would not have so profound a hold upon us. With religion, we can go, so to speak, as far as we like, in any direction. Impure, because it is integral with our vitality, it invites us to every excess and sets no limit to our euphoria, nor to our downfall in God. It is because wisdom possesses none of these advantages that it is so deadly to the man who seeks to manifest himself, to exercise his gifts. Wisdom is that continual ascesis we approach only by sabotaging whatever irreplaceable stocks of good and evil we possess. Wisdom leads nowhere. It is an impasse made into a discipline. Instead of ecstasy, which excuses and redeems all religions, what does it offer? A system of capitulations, restraint, abstention, withdrawal, not only from this, but from all worlds, a mineral serenity, a preference for petrifaction, out of fear of both pleasure and pain. Next to Epictetus, any saint, Christian or otherwise, looks like a madman. Saints are feverish and histrionic temperaments who seduce and involve us. They flatter our weaknesses by the very violence with which they denounce us. Moreover, they give us the impression that we can reach some understanding with them. A minimum of extravagance or cunning would do the trick. With the sages, on the contrary, neither compromise nor risk is possible. They find rage odious, reject all its forms, and identify it with the source of aberrations. A source of energy, rather, thinks the man of depression, who clings to rage because he knows it is positive, dynamic, even if it turns against him. It is not in inertia that we commit suicide. It is in a fit of rage against ourselves. Ajax remains the typical suicide. In the exasperation of a sentiment which might be defined as follows: I can no longer bear to be disappointed by myself. This supreme spasm of disappointment, even if we anticipated it only at rare intervals, is one whose obsession would never leave us had we decided once and for all not to kill ourselves. If, for many years, a voice assured us we would not raise a hand against ourselves, that voice, with age, becomes less and less audible. The longer we live, the more we are at the mercy of some explosive silence. The man who kills himself proves thereby that he might have killed others as well, that he even felt such an impulse, but turned it against himself. And if he seems underhanded in doing so, it is because he follows the meanders of self-hatred and meditates with perfidious cruelty the blow to which he will succumb, not without having first reconsidered his birth, which he will forthwith lay under a curse. It is our birth, in fact, that we must attend to if we want to extirpate the evil at its source. To abominate our birth is reasonable, yet difficult and unwonted. We take a stand against death, against what must come. Birth, a much more irreparable event, we leave to one side, pay little or no attention to it. To each man it appears as far in the past as the world's first moment. Only a man who plans to suppress himself reaches back that far. It seems he cannot forget the unnameable mechanism of procreation, and that he tries, by a retrospective horror, to annihilate the very seed from which he has sprung. Inventive and enterprising, The rage for self-destruction does not confine itself to wresting only individuals from torpor. It seizes upon entire nations as well, and lets them renew themselves by compelling them to act in flagrant contradiction to their traditions. A nation which seemed to be proceeding towards sclerosis was actually heading for catastrophe, and helped itself to do so by means of the very mission it had undertaken. To doubt the necessity of disaster is to resign oneself to consternation. It is to make it impossible for oneself to understand the vogue fatality assumes at certain moments. The key to all that is inexplicable in history may well be found in such rage against oneself, in the terror of satiety and repetition, in the fact that man will always prefer the unheard of to routine. The phenomenon is also conceivable on the scale of whole species. How could so many have disappeared by the mere caprice of climate? Is it not likely that after millions and millions of years the great mammals finally wearied of wandering the globe, that they reached that degree of explosive lassitude where instinct, competing with consciousness, sides against itself? Whatever lives asserts and denies itself in frenzy. To let oneself die is a sign of weakness. To annihilate oneself, of strength. Worst of all is the collapse into that condition where we cannot even imagine the desire to destroy ourselves. It is paradoxical, and perhaps improper, to prosecute indifference after having implored it so long for the peace and the incuriosity of the corpse. Why draw back when at last it begins to oblige, and when it still preserves the same prestige for us? Is it not a betrayal to turn against the idol we have venerated most of all? Certainly there is an element of happiness in any reversal. Any about-face affords an increase in vigor. Denial rejuvenates. Our strength being measured by the sum of beliefs we have abjured, each of us should end his career as a deserter from every cause. If, despite the enthusiasm with which it has inspired us, indifference ends by alarming us, by seeming intolerable, this is precisely because by suspending the course of our desertions, it attacks the very principle of our being and prevents its expansion. Perhaps it has a negative essence we failed to guard against in time. By adopting it without reservation, we could not avoid those pangs of radical incuriosity, an abyss into which no one plunges without emerging unrecognizable. The man who has merely glimpsed those depths no longer aspires to resemble the dead, nor to gaze, as they do, elsewhere, at something else, anything else, except appearance. What he wants is to return to the living, and to recover among them his old miseries which he has trodden underfoot in his progress toward detachment. We lose our way, following in the footsteps of a sage, if we are not one ourselves. Sooner or later we weary, we turn aside, we break with him, if only out of the passion for breaking. We declare war on him as we do on everything, beginning with the ideal we have not been able to realize. Having invoked Pyrrho and Lao Tzu for years, is it admissible to betray them when we are more imbued with their teaching than ever? But are we really betraying them? Can we presume to regard ourselves as their victim when we can blame them for nothing but being right? It is not comfortable, the condition of a man who, having asked wisdom to free him from himself and the world, comes to the point of detesting it, of finding it merely one shackle more.